In this episode, we're going to connect a lot of the ideas you already know about least privilege and safe defaults to the part of cloud environments that attackers love most, the control plane. The control plane is where settings live, where permissions are granted, where services are turned on, and where powerful changes happen that can affect an entire environment in minutes. When people hear about cloud breaches, they often picture someone stealing data directly, but many real incidents start earlier, with someone gaining the ability to change how services behave. Locking down service settings and permissions is how you reduce that risk, not by making everything impossible to manage, but by making the management surface deliberate, narrow, and observable. A beginner-friendly way to think about it is that the control plane is the set of levers that can move walls, doors, and cameras, so you want those levers protected even more carefully than the rooms behind them. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To understand the risk clearly, it helps to separate the control plane from the data plane, because they are different surfaces with different consequences. The data plane is the normal flow of business activity, like applications reading and writing data, users retrieving content, or systems passing messages between components. The control plane is the administrative layer where you create resources, change configurations, manage identities, adjust networking, and grant or revoke access. Even if your data plane is locked down, a weak control plane can undo that work by changing a setting that makes data reachable or by granting a permission that opens a path to sensitive resources. This is why defenders treat the control plane as the highest value target area, because it can reshape the environment faster than an attacker could by stealing data one file at a time. When you hear the phrase control plane risk, think of it as the risk that someone can change the rules rather than just play within them. Attackers prioritize the control plane because it offers leverage, stealth, and persistence, and those three advantages explain why configuration security matters so much. Leverage means one successful admin-level action can expand access across many services, such as granting broader permissions, disabling logging, or changing network exposure. Stealth means an attacker can make changes that reduce visibility, like altering audit settings or redirecting logs, which makes later investigation harder. Persistence means the attacker can create new identities, new access keys, or new trusted connections that survive password resets and cleanup efforts, allowing them to return. Beginners sometimes assume that control plane attacks require advanced hacking, but many are simply credential abuse combined with permissive permissions. If an attacker steals a privileged account or compromises an application identity that has too much power, the control plane becomes the fastest route to meaningful impact. Reducing that risk starts with making privileged access rare and tightly bounded. The most foundational control plane defense is strong identity design, because permissions are only as safe as the identities that hold them. In cloud environments, permissions are typically managed through Identity and Access Management, IAM, which is the system that defines who can act, what they can do, and which resources they can affect. A common beginner mistake is to think of IAM as an admin-only concern, but it is actually the central map of trust in the environment. When IAM is messy, with shared accounts, broad roles, and unclear ownership, it becomes easy to accidentally grant too much power and hard to tell who is responsible for changes. Locking down the control plane means creating a clean separation between everyday identities and privileged identities, and then keeping privileged identities limited to the smallest set of people and systems that truly need them. The fewer privileged identities you have, the fewer targets attackers can pursue, and the easier it is to watch the ones that remain. Once identity is clean, least privilege becomes your main tool for controlling what each identity can do, and control plane least privilege is more important than most people realize. Permissions should be specific not only about the resources, but also about the actions, because control plane actions like create, modify, delete, and grant access are high impact. Role-based access control, RBAC, is a common way to manage this safely, where roles represent job functions and are granted only the permissions required for that function. The key is to avoid roles that feel convenient but effectively mean do anything, because those roles turn small credential theft into broad compromise. A beginner-friendly test is to ask what damage could be done if this identity is stolen, and then reduce permissions until that damage is limited to what the job truly requires. When roles are narrowly defined, you also gain better detection, because the expected behavior of each role becomes clearer and anomalies become stronger signals. Separation of duties is another concept that reduces control plane risk by ensuring no single person or system can both request and approve the most dangerous changes without oversight. In practice, this means the individual who wants a broad permission change is not the same individual who can grant it without review, and it means highly impactful changes follow an approval pattern rather than a casual click. Beginners sometimes worry that this will slow everything down, but the goal is not to add friction everywhere, only where the blast radius is large. Granting a role that can modify identity settings or network exposure is very different from changing a cosmetic configuration or adjusting a non-sensitive parameter. When separation of duties is used wisely, it reduces the chance of both malicious abuse and accidental misconfiguration because a second set of eyes catches mistakes. It also discourages the habit of making quick, risky changes during stress because the environment is designed to require deliberateness for high-impact actions. Locking down service settings is about more than permissions because services themselves often have configuration switches that affect exposure, data handling, and security posture. Many managed services include features that are helpful in development, such as broad access modes, debug output, or simplified integration options, and those features can be dangerous in production. The control plane is where those features are turned on, so controlling who can change service settings is as important as controlling who can access data. A useful habit is to define which settings are security critical, such as those that enable public access, weaken authentication, broaden network reachability, or reduce logging. Then you ensure only a small set of trusted identities can modify those settings, and you ensure those changes are monitored closely. Beginners should recognize that the most damaging misconfigurations are often just one setting away, which is why control plane governance focuses on the settings that move the biggest risk levers. Strong authentication is the next layer, because control plane permissions are meaningless if attackers can log in as privileged users. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, is a baseline requirement for administrative access because it reduces the chance that a stolen password alone grants control plane power. Even so, you should assume attackers will try to bypass or abuse MFA through phishing and social engineering, which is why you also want tight session controls and careful handling of privileged sessions. Single sign-on, SSO, can help by centralizing authentication, enforcing consistent policy, and making account lifecycle management cleaner, but it must be configured with the same discipline as everything else. The goal is to make privileged access require strong proof of identity every time it matters, not just when someone first logs in. When authentication and authorization work together, attackers have to solve more than one problem, which makes control plane compromise far less likely. Access constraints add another defensive ring by controlling the context in which control plane access is allowed, because stolen credentials are most dangerous when they can be used from anywhere. Restricting administrative access to trusted networks, limiting it to managed devices, and requiring re-authentication for sensitive actions all reduce the value of stolen sessions. This is especially important because many attackers prefer to steal tokens and reuse existing sessions rather than repeatedly triggering login prompts. Context-based constraints also make anomalies easier to detect because privileged access should originate from a small set of known environments. If a privileged session appears from an unexpected network or device, that is immediately suspicious even if the credentials are correct. Beginners should see how this connects to earlier ideas about shrinking attack surface, because context constraints shrink where the control plane can be reached from. When you combine strong authentication with strong context constraints, control plane access becomes both harder to steal and harder to reuse. Change control is where secure design turns into durable reality, because control plane risk rises when changes are frequent, informal, and poorly tracked. Every configuration change is a potential shift in exposure, and every permission grant is a potential expansion of blast radius. Locking down the control plane means treating high-impact changes as events that require intent, review, and traceability, so you can answer who changed what and why. This is not about bureaucracy for its own sake. It is about preventing drift into permissive settings that nobody remembers approving. Beginners often assume that misconfigurations are rare, but in fast-moving cloud environments, misconfigurations are often the natural result of constant change without guardrails. When change control is disciplined, you reduce both accidental errors and the chance that an attacker can quietly modify settings to create persistence. A secure control plane is one where powerful changes leave a clear trail and are difficult to make silently. Logging discipline is essential because control plane attacks are often discovered through changes, not through obvious breakage, and you need reliable records to investigate. You want to capture administrative actions, permission changes, service configuration edits, and any changes to security-relevant settings like logging itself. Those logs should be retained long enough to support investigation, and they should be protected from tampering, because attackers who gain control plane access often try to hide their tracks. Centralizing logs into a Security Information and Event Management (SIEM) system is one way organizations manage analysis and alerting at scale, but the deeper lesson is that control plane logs are high-value security data. When you can see who elevated privileges, who changed network exposure, and who modified a service's access posture, you can detect risky behavior early. Beginners should remember that without control plane logs, you may not even know what rules were changed, which makes recovery slow and uncertain. Detection becomes much stronger when you treat certain control plane actions as high-signal events that deserve immediate attention, because administrative activity should be relatively rare compared to normal application traffic. A sudden grant of a broad role, the creation of a new privileged identity, or a change that enables public access is not ordinary background noise. It is a meaningful moment in the security story of the environment. This is also where access patterns matter, because each admin role should have a typical rhythm, and deviations should stand out. If a role that normally performs routine maintenance suddenly performs identity management changes or modifies logging, that is suspicious even if the account is legitimate. Beginners often think detection is about catching malware, but in the control plane, detection is often about noticing unexpected administrative decisions. When you design the system so that dangerous actions are rare and obvious, detection becomes simpler and faster, which reduces the time attackers have to deepen their control. Hardening service settings also includes turning off or constraining features that increase exposure without adding necessary value, because cloud services often offer convenience options that widen the attack surface. Public access modes, permissive integration defaults, overly broad trust relationships, and diagnostic features that reveal too much information can all be exploited. Even when a feature is not directly vulnerable, it can create conditions that make exploitation easier, such as weakening boundaries or leaking configuration details. Locking down service settings means starting from a hardened baseline and requiring deliberate justification for enabling risky capabilities. It also means ensuring that services are configured to use encrypted connections, that insecure legacy behaviors are avoided, and that administrative endpoints are separated from user-facing traffic. Beginners should focus on the idea that features are not free, because every enabled capability becomes something you must secure and monitor. A disciplined control plane makes risky features the exception rather than the default. Another often overlooked part of control plane risk reduction is preventing configuration drift, because a service can be hardened on day one and then slowly become permissive through updates, team changes, and one-off troubleshooting choices. Drift is dangerous because it is silent, and silence is the enemy of security. A durable approach defines what secure looks like for critical services and then checks regularly whether the current configuration still matches that intended posture. This includes checking permissions, checking exposure settings, and checking that logging and monitoring remain enabled and intact. Drift detection is also about catching shadow changes, like a new service created outside standard patterns or a role granted in a way that bypasses normal review. Beginners should notice that this is the same problem as permission creep in storage, but at the service and management layer, where the consequences can be broader. When you treat the baseline as a living standard, you keep the control plane stable even as the environment evolves. When control plane risk does materialize, a good response strategy depends on having designed your permissions and settings in a way that allows precise containment. If a privileged identity is suspected of compromise, you want to be able to disable or restrict it without shutting down the entire environment. If a risky permission change is discovered, you want to be able to roll it back cleanly and confirm what resources were affected. This is why narrow roles and separation of duties matter, because they limit the scope of what any one identity can change quickly. It is also why strong logging matters, because you need to reconstruct the sequence of changes and identify whether the attacker created persistence through new identities or altered settings. Beginners should understand that response is not just reacting to a breach. It is also restoring the environment's rule set back to a safe, known state. A hardened control plane makes that restoration possible without guessing. To wrap this up, reducing control plane risk is about protecting the layer that defines your cloud's rules, because attackers who can change the rules can often bypass the protections you built elsewhere. You start by treating privileged identity design through IAM as foundational, keeping privileged accounts few, separate, and accountable. You apply least privilege with our BAC so roles are narrowly scoped and high-impact actions are not casually available. You use separation of duties and discipline change control to prevent quick mistakes and to make dangerous actions deliberate and traceable. You enforce strong authentication with MFA, strengthen it with SSO policies, and constrain it with trusted contexts so stolen credentials are harder to reuse. You lock down service settings that control exposure and trust, and you monitor and retain control plane logs so unexpected administrative behavior becomes visible quickly. When these pieces work together, the control plane becomes a hardened, observable management surface rather than an easy shortcut for attackers, and that is one of the most effective ways to keep cloud environments stable, defensible, and resilient over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.